The Edge of Conflict Resolution by Noel Plaugher. Conrad Koenig rode the ascending elevator in a state of focused, relaxed meditation. His eyes were closed, his breathing deep. One of his hands handheld the handle of his briefcase. The other rested lightly on the hilt of his steel katana. It was a long ride up to the top, but one that the high-achieving business leader was used to. The Macmillan building was over 100 stories tall. As high as it rose, though, it was only average in the shimmering glass and steel skyline of the vast and towering megalopolis that was Ipan City. Conrad kept at bay the noise and bustle of people getting on and off the elevator. He only opened his eyes when he felt the brush of another executive's katana, albeit softly and unavoidably, against his leg. It was hard to avoid incidental contact in the close confines of the elevator, so Conrad, like all executives, never took offense. An executive had to be gracious and judicious, as everyone makes mistakes. Executive etiquette dictated that a slight was only to be avenged if purposeful. Once Conrad arrived at the 103rd floor, he allowed everyone to get off ahead of him, and then purposefully stepped into the hallway. He paused momentarily to adjust his tie and give a slight brush to his sleeves, more out of obsessive ritual than from cleanliness. Lastly, he adjusted the katana so that the blade was facing up. He knew that the morning's meeting could be contentious, and he didn't want to be caught at a disadvantage. His new rival, Hamilton, would likely try to suggest a counter to the proposal he was planning to make. If it went to a duel, Conrad was ready. As Koenig rounded the corner and passed the glass-walled lobby at the administration floor, he started to count his breaths. It helped to calm his mind and body. He had learned to govern himself, the one and only thing that was ever under his control. As he moved through the overly wide automatic glass door and past the reception desk, he continued to practice the centering techniques that he had learned during his earliest days in executive training. Even though many years had passed since then, he still could hear the words of his first instructor echoing in his mind. One must center oneself before a meeting and be ready for any eventuality. Every interaction has the potential for combat. Never forget it. The instructor had looked each of them in the eye in turn for what seemed like a long time to hammer his point home. Conrad believed that his remarkable success as an executive was due in part to never having wavered from that first and most important principle. The memory was vivid for Conrad and still shocking when he reflected upon his first meeting. The chief financial officer was struck down by the chairman. The CFO had been noticeably upset even before the confrontation began. His presentation on the decline on the fourth quarter sales had been rambling, as if he had come to the meeting fully prepared to discuss it. He had no real explanation or justification for the failure. Then, when the chairman rose, assumed the fighting stance, and drew his sword, the CFO seemed utterly astounded. He looked like someone who had never imagined he might actually have to duel that day. A foolish mistake, a deadly one. Every day had the potential for a duel. Every day. When the CFO drew his sword, he was visibly uncentered, something anyone could easily detect. No doubt the entire boardroom sensed that the CFO was about to be struck down. The controller clearly knew it. He was apparently readying himself to take his boss's position. As his hand had dropped from the methodical caress of his pen to touch the long handle of his katana, everyone around the table must have noticed the move. Most had likely already made their personal calculation and decided that they weren't willing to risk involvement. When it was over, the controller would be the new CFO. From the first hint of confrontation, the combatants' focus was so intense that they must have been oblivious to the lunch delivery coming through the door. The chairman and the CFO stood as still as pillars, eyes locked on each other. They began to sidestep in unison for a better position to fight inside the fully furnished conference room. Sarah, the executive assistant, quietly slipped through the door and was kind enough to hand Conrad his roast beef on sourdough with lettuce and tomato. She squinted her welcoming smile at him. He returned a knowing nod in acknowledgement. She then tiptoed quietly out of the conference room, as if careful not to draw attention away from the duel. Mouthing the words, "I'll come back later with the coffee," she slipped back out of the room as quietly as she had entered, softly closing the door behind her. The two executives stood facing each other, silent, steely-eyed, poised for combat. The CFO's suit was beginning to show the familiar signs of impending failure. Everyone in the room could witness the dark circles of sweat growing larger under the armpits of his charcoal gray suit. Even from Conrad's seat, far from the action, he could see beads of sweat forming and streaming down the CFO's face. The man looked scared. The chairman, in contrast, appeared to be masterfully composed. He seemed cool and relaxed, projecting the highest level of unity of mind, body, and spirit. In a flash of silver, the CFO attacked. The arc of the strike rose and then fell on a diagonal line toward the neck of the chairman, but it was quickly and easily blocked. The chairman then countered with a horizontal slice across the body of the CFO, which started on one side of his torso and then split across his abdomen. The chairman quickly moved away and out of the range of the CFO's sword. The grimace on the injured man's face was a twisted and intense look that betrayed the excruciating pain of being sliced open. Then he became expressionless, melting lower, falling to his knees, and finally ending up face down to the floor. Everyone watched, starkly silent, as his life force drained away. It had been a tough first meeting for Conrad as he looked around at the wide eyes, the disbelieving head shakes, and noted the big exhalations of acknowledgement all around him. Most of his co-workers, like himself, had just come out of executive training and hadn't unsheathed their katana in a real confrontation yet. It gave them all pause. They knew that sooner or later they would be putting their skills to work. For now, though, the situation was over, and the room seemed to relax. No one looked up when the bodymen appeared for removal and cleanup, as everyone had already begun eating their lunch. Conrad looked around for Sarah to see if she had returned with the coffee yet. It was a powerful lesson that Conrad Koenig never forgot. With every subsequent meeting, he went on remembering the first one. He knew the best preparation was a calm mind, a mind ready to either propose a sound idea or to strike a deadly blow in combat. Both were equally important. It didn't matter how good your ideas were if you couldn't defend them with deadly force. Your briefcase and your katana form your dual source of power, and it would serve every executive well to never forget it. Not if they wanted to survive. Sudden death was accepted in the life of the executive. As Conrad approached the conference room, he took note of all the prior arrivals to make sure that he would be the last one to enter. That was his plan. He always liked to arrive later and hopefully make his opponent anxious about his appearance. Though Conrad had made his presentation on the best marketing programs many times before, He instinctively felt that there would be a disruption this time. It wasn't just Hamilton. He knew that there was more than one new executive looking to take his job. And he sensed that this would be the best time for one of them, or possibly all of them, to make their move. Conrad had diligently prepared his presentation over the weekend, verifying all the numbers and making sure that his conclusions aligned with senior management. He didn't want to do battle with everyone at once. He needed management on his side to avoid having to deal with two groups of opponents at once. Conrad had a long-term strategy. First, he would deal with the challengers, and then he would make his own move for the senior vice president's position at the executive retreat later in the year. He knew that the popularity of the current SVP was waning, and he suspected that he would be welcomed if he successfully won his duel. He had every intention of winning. He walked through the door into the conference room and addressed everyone at once. "It seems that I'm a bit late," he said. "I had to pick up my suit from the cleaners and, well, you know how that is." Conrad finished with his $1,000,000 smile and a charming wink that took in nearly everyone. Hamilton, the newest executive fresh out of training, was the only one who didn't smile back. When Conrad put down his briefcase, he snuck a look under the table, an old technique, and saw that Hamilton had his hand resting on his katana. After he gave his presentation, Conrad looked around the room for questions. The beaming faces of senior management assured him that there would be no challenge from any of them. Conrad then started stepping in reverse, with his back turned toward Hamilton, as he answered a question from a colleague about the use of discounting versus free product for promotion. It was a good question, Conrad thought. As he continued walking backward toward Hamilton, Conrad felt the air shift suddenly as Hamilton rose without warning behind him. He knew the man was starting to draw his katana. Conrad unsheathed his sword faster, stabbing backward unexpectedly. He never looked at Hamilton, but he knew by instinct that he had stabbed him low in the abdomen, certain that he had pierced at least one major organ. Conrad turned. Hamilton's face was a static mask of surprise and pain. He slowly fell to his knees and then to the floor, gasping for air, before finally expiring. Conrad observed his rival lying lifeless on the floor in a dark crimson puddle. He was the victor. He grabbed a napkin off the table and wiped the blood from his blade with one motion of his wrist. Conrad smiled, sheathed his sword, closed his briefcase. Casually folding his arms, he asked, "Are there any more questions?" The end.